Hi, everyone. Welcome to week one of Intro to Media. This is our first chapter lecture. Each week, you'll get a lecture on however many chapters we're assigned in reading. I'll also usually talk about some of the other readings that we have during the week. In the future, all of your lectures will be likely video. I'm having some problems with my computer, which is why this is also being a little bit late being uploaded, and I apologize. So for today, we're just getting an audio lecture. Our textbook is the Media and Culture, Mass Communication in the Digital Age. All of you should have this. It's critical that it is the 13th edition. You should all have it through the first day program, but I know it's a little bit pricey. If you don't want to buy it that way, if you want to return it, you can also rent it for, I believe, $45 for the semester. There's a link for that. If that's still prohibitive for you, let me know. Chapters 1 through 3 are already posted, so you have this week and next week covered. Those of you who are on campus, there is a desk copy of this. Okay, so we're going to go through basically the outline of what it is that this textbook does, what it is we're sort of doing, and understanding what media studies even is. So we'll define key concepts, communication, culture, but with specific meanings for this textbook, and also some new terms that have been developed in the last few years and are critical to this particular edition. We will investigate important periods in communication history. This course is a mixture of media literacy and history class. So some of you are taking this for history credit. So be prepared for about half of the course to be really focused on the histories and developments of media technologies. I will not, however, be heavily focused on names and dates, just so you know. A little bit, but not entirely. The other thing we're going to do in this week is learn how the digital revolution and media convergence have shaped today's culture and media environment. This week is about outlining the contemporary situation we're in, and then we go into a history period. We're outlining what defines our particular moment in media history. And then we're going to learn some tools that can help us think differently about media and consider how it's studied. We're going to look at issues related to the politics of media and representation and storytelling. And then we're going to talk about how judgment, opinions that we have about media reflect historically specific and political circumstances. And then finally, you're going to learn a new process called the critical process that you're going to use in all of your assignments for this class. Now, practice media literacy in a kind of structured way. So that's the overview of what we're going to do this week. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a really quick overview of my research and why I'm here. Okay, so at SCI, the School of Communication and Information, those of you who are or may join JMS, that is the school that JMS is in, Journalism and Media Studies. I am in the Media Studies department, and I study art in relationship to social media. And a lot of people have asked me over the years, why would anyone want to study art in a media studies program instead of doing it in an art history program? And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is, because I think it's a good explanation about what media studies is and what we're doing with this course, like what's important for us here. So this sculpture that's here, if any of you are from Chicago, this is called the Flamingo. It is in downtown Chicago. It has been there since the early 1970s. It was by an artist named Calder, and it was initially commissioned by a federal arts organization called the Art and Architecture Program, housed under the General Services Administration, which is basically the landlords for all federally owned buildings. So this was my very first job for the organization that commissioned this. And my window was right outside, like right above this. And so I used to watch people engage with this every day. And so many things happened there. And it became a site of where people would meet each other. Back when I had this job, people didn't have cell phones yet. So you would say, I'll meet you at this time at this place. And this was one of the kinds of landmark locations that people would cite for that. Also, it's a place where people have had picnics and protests and proposals. So art history would be interested in knowing who made this, why they made it, when they made it, right? Those are the major questions of art history. And then a lot of information about the intentions of the artist. But it didn't really ask any of the questions about the stuff I was seeing, about how people were responding to this. I wanted to think about those things. Just like in art history, media studies is also going to be interested in the art itself or the object, or as we use the word in media studies, content, right? What's being created, whether it's a film or a book, or that is the content, that is what's the story that's in the book, the art itself that's in the gallery or in public space. That is our content, right? So art history and media are both interested in that. And to some extent, both art history and media studies are interested in who makes the thing, right? So art history is interested in the artist that makes it. They might be interested in who helped support that project, but they tend to be less interested in some of the larger institutional questions, right? I was interested in that organization that I work for, the General Services Administration, because I wanted to know what kind of an investment a federal landlord structure, kind of administrative body, would have in the production of public art. What would be their interest in that? And of course, it came to be that this is a question of cultural diplomacy. This was created during the Cold War. It was a way of creating a sense of cohesive culture, or what we'll talk about later, a consensus narrative about the national identity. That's something that's less interesting to art history. Not entirely not interesting at all, but typically not very well studied. But the thing that really sets media studies apart from other kinds of studies of the content that exists in media is the way that audiences use and interact with the media that they encounter. That means Chicagoans protests here. That means people who have used photographs of this in ads or whatever. The way that people take things and create meaning for them, for themselves, and for their communities. So how are we as audiences engaging with media as both sometimes makers or remakers or responders, but also just in the process of how we consume it, and that process not being passive, right? This is a big part of what we're going to think about this semester. Okay, so this lecture is going to be broken up into sections that will actually match the major headings in your book chapter if you want to follow along that way. And the video should have chapter markers so that you should be able to take breaks and follow along as you like. So our first one is looking at understanding media today. So in this first part, a lot of what we're going to do is we're going to break down some of the terms and definitions that our book throws at us and also consider the world that we live in at the moment. Our first most basic definitions for this course, media and medium. And this is one of the first things our chapter addresses, and we need to clarify what we're talking about when we use these words. By definition, media refers to a kind of mass communication, right? It is a plural form of medium, medium being the materials through which something is created. But we don't necessarily use it that way. What it typically means is the main means of mass communication, broadcasting, publishing, internet. This is all of the ways that we use media. And it is technically a plural, but people rarely use it as one. An important understanding of medium for our class is the means by which something is communicated or expressed. So a medium is something that facilitates communication or expression. And media refers collectively to different mediums that exist in our lives that facilitate communication and expression. When we talk about something like Facebook or Instagram, it combines so many different things in part of a larger system of media, of digital communication that doesn't just facilitate communication, right? It structures and changes how and what we communicate. Important for thinking about media is that stories and narratives are foundational to media. And we're going to talk more about narrative as we move on in this week. We make sense of ourselves, of our experiences, of the world outside through stories and through narratives that we tell and through the ones that we see in films and books and music. And those feed into each other, right? So you have ideas about yourself based on things that you've consumed in media. And then media is then produced based on the stories people have that they carry with them. So media allows us to tell stories and narrativize ourselves, but it also allows us to see stories and narratives of others, which can have powerful impacts. Media are powerful because they enable the creation and circulation of these stories and narratives, and these stories and narratives then have big effects. They affect changes culturally. So this is what we're going to think about a lot, and we're going to talk a lot about what it means to be aware of the kinds of narratives that are existing in the media that we're consuming, and also the ways that we then are relying on those narratives in the ways that we understand ourselves. Okay, so our next big question then is media literacy. And this course is really designed to help you build media literacy. This is probably something that's come up for you before in life, probably even something that you've been taught before. So it's really just the idea that we should all have an understanding of how media works to create meaning and to construct knowledge in society. And our book authors argue that this kind of media literacy requires a specific form of critical engagement. And this is where the critical process comes from. It's really a structure and a system for helping you build media literacy in a like systematized way so that you're not just having to piece it together yourself. It's a good introduction as well for any of you who might ever get involved in doing social science research. Okay, so we're going to do a little quick thought exercise that you're just going to do with yourself through this lecture. I want you to think about a piece of media that was really important to you when you were younger. This could be something like a book or a song or a show that you loved. It could be something that was really important or memorable for other reasons, like maybe you don't like it, or maybe it just was really resonant at a really important time in your life, or it affected, or it was something that happened on the news that affected the way that you saw the world, for instance. Okay, now I want you to ask yourself why this media was so important to you. How did it become so significant and impactful on your identity as you've grown up? And I want you to think a little bit about how your understandings of the world have changed over time and ask yourself, is this media still important to you? If it's still important to you, why? How has it impacted how you understand the world? And then think a little bit about, has it changed over time? Your relationship to this media, does it change? Like, if you have a favorite book, do you feel like you've outgrown it? Do you feel your perspective on it has changed? If you have a book that you've reread several times or a television series that you've binged over and over again, how have your relationships to that media changed as part of your changing? If you thought of something that shaped your understanding of the world, in other words, a really important news event in history as you were growing up that happened that shifted how you understand things, does that still feel true to you today? Or has it informed the way that you're thinking in a way that's now different? What do you think of your current media preferences and understandings? Say about your identity or how you saw yourself in relationship to a character in a beloved book or film. How do you see the world now? How does that favorite piece of media or impactful story from childhood fit into your current identity or understanding of the world? How does what you like connect to how you understand yourself and how you engage with others? What we consume, the media, is one of the ways that we actually then filter that through our sense of self. And that's one of the ways we use media, right? How are you thinking through media? This is just something to get you guys to start understanding media outside of just something that's external. This is about you understanding the impacts of your relationship with media. Okay, so just like our larger book, this lecture also has a little chunk of it that's about looking at our history in relationship to media. The 21st century is going to be defined by some things we're going to get into in a minute looking at. But before we get there, we're going to take one step back and look at the concept of mass media. So mass media is opportunities for really large numbers of people to be consuming media at the same time or in relationship to one another, right? Before the existence of mass media, we're really dealing with things that are very interpersonal, one-to-one basis of communication. Mass media is where you have the ability to speak from one to many or from one organization to many people, right? So this is how we get to this place. And these are industries that produce and distribute all of the media that we consume. So mass media is a form of communication and cultural communication in particular that exists on this mass scale. But communication and culture do not require mass dissemination in order to exist. They do require some degree of exchange. So communication is the creation of symbol systems. So that can be languages, it can be emojis, it can be computer code. Communication is the structures by which we convey culture. And culture are the expressions of individuals, groups, and societies that are used to make sense of their daily life and articulate their values. Culture is a process that delivers those values from a society through meaning-making forms. Communication helps us express culture and also delineate difference. We speak the same languages, whether that's, again, like actual spoken languages or knowing the right emojis for a Reddit group. That's a form of communication that defines that specific culture. Cultures can be very small and they can be very large groups as well. They can be nations. They can also be niche groups. What marks our current moment and what makes the current moment really different is that we don't just have mass media. Mass media, like I said, was really defined by the ability of filmmakers or musicians or whatever to create a form of communication, a cultural object that then was shared with many people, right? So that means someone writes a book and it's published and lots of people read it, or everyone goes and sees the same film, or this is the reason that slide had a picture of Elvis on it, is because that degree of fame was really new to that moment of mass media, television in particular, right? Broadcast media where everyone had 4 channels that they all watched. Culture was really large. It was really homogenous in many ways, but it also was really wide-reaching for the first time. What we have now is mass personal communication. And mass personal communication is a method of communication that mixes and matches aspects of both mass and interpersonal communication, is the talking to your friend next to you, right? Or making a phone call, right? That is interpersonal communication. It's 2 people talking to each other or maybe a small group of people. That's interpersonal. But if you have broadcast, that's one person speaking to many people. And what mass personal communication does is it combines those two. So you can be in your home making a TikTok that will end up being received by many people. And that degree of communication reach has never been available before to individuals, right? It's been available to a very small group, but it has not been as available to so many people, right? So now we have many individuals broadcasting out to many other people, which is a very new moment. And this is mass personal communication. This is an important one for you guys to know. And we're going to talk throughout this semester about what that means. and how you guys are experiencing that. And I want to hear your input on this a lot. Our next key term is affordances. And these are the features or capabilities of a technology that help establish how we use it. So, what kind of information does the technology allow us to send? How quickly? In what form? In other words, what the telephone afforded was the ability for one person to call another person. And that was a new technology at the time, right? Or what radio afforded was the first ability for voice from one person to reach many people at once. So the affordance is what does it allow us to do, right? And in both of those instances, it also is allowing us to do it immediately as opposed to a recording that then gets sent out later. So think about affordances in terms of what it allows and how, and in what form, and to whom. We'll talk more about that. So we have eras in early and mass communication. So the terms that we've just been talking about of mass communication, mass personal communication, and the affordances of technologies are important for us to think through this past period too, right? So let's take the term affordances and apply it to these different periods. You have before mass communication, you have early communication, and that's divided into two sections, right? You have the oral based histories and communication models, and then you have written, which means handwritten, right? So oral communication affords a kind of flexibility, right? If you're communicating primarily orally, then histories can change. They can develop and shift based on the communities that are telling them. Stories are flexible. That's a kind of affordance in itself. When you start to have written communication, that allows for a kind of formalization of narrative that stays consistent. That's an affordance. It's also potentially a kind of a loss, right? Which is something we'll think a lot about. Every time we have a new technology, what it affords us also means that something else isn't happening the same way anymore. To go from oral and written communication to the birth of print and the printing press. And although your book likes to tell you that this emerged with Gutenberg in Europe, movable type existed in Asia before they ever existed in Europe. But the printing press and the ability to make multiples of the press itself was what made the Gutenberg press most known throughout history. Also, of course, there are other factors. But just to give you guys a little bit of a grain of salt in relationship to the textbook, the Gutenberg press is not the first movable print. But it did have the largest impact on culture because of its ability to then be reproduced itself, the press itself. This was the beginning of mass communication for lots of people to be able to have access to information directly. So what that means, what it does to suddenly have many people being able to read the same thing and not have to rely on somebody to read it to them from a handwritten book, which is what Bibles and most communication was for a very long time, up until 14th century. Not everyone was literate, not everyone had access, and all of these things had to be handwritten. That meant that the vast majority of people were reliant entirely on what they were told by others. So you can think about what that means on a power structure level. That means that the people who have access to that information and who then disseminate that information have quite a lot of power compared to what happens when you suddenly have this easier, faster, and more accessible model of people being able to get information and be able to share that information. A book can be passed around hand to hand. People become more literate. This produces revolution and criticisms of power structures that existed at the time. It also produces an expansion of the ideas of individualism, right? Suddenly you have the self engaging with information as opposed to a community hearing information collectively. That doesn't mean the self never existed before, but this is an expanding notion of individualism and to some extent a loss of collectivism in community that comes with that, right? So this is the very beginning of our mass communication. Following print, we have the emergence of electronic technologies. And this doesn't really fully start to take off until the 19th century. What we're having here is the ability for sound and pictures to be captured and communicated from one to many, right? Or from one to one even, right? So telephony is a one-to-one. This is the beginning of instant communication. A book takes a great deal of time to print. Even if you're not having to handwrite it and it's infinitely faster, then when you did, now you can put it in a printing press. You still have to write the book. You have to turn all of that handwritten writing into print that then gets reproduced. And then those things need to be bound and distributed. It takes quite a lot of time. So if you think about an important idea, how quickly it moves, that's going to be a much slower movement than what you start to get with the ability to communicate over radio waves and television waves. So broadcast is the beginning of information as well as a kind of commodity. And then you also, with that, have the rise of the beginning of corporate control. We're going to talk so much about the kinds of companies that facilitated the beginning of the telephone and the telegraph system, and then eventually radio, TV, and film, and how those set the ground for this very small group of companies that control everything now, how that was already seated in this history. And this is where you get the birth of the mass nation, mass communication, mass culture, where a large percentage of a diverse population is consuming the same media. And that contributes to another one of our important terms for the chapter. So mass nation and consensus narratives. This produces huge consensus narratives. They reflect specific values and assumptions about what the world is, how it should be. And in this process, they establish a kind of mainstream idea of American culture and identity. And that is controlled by those in power, right? Very few people end up having control over those narratives. And we're going to talk what it means to have such minimal representation and few people in control. So then finally, that brings us to the digital era. And you're going to learn all about the birth of the internet and how this has impacted so many things, right? Digital communication converts content. So whether that's text or music or whatever, into a binary code that can then be reassembled, decoded on the other end. That's what's happening when you're watching something streaming, when you're putting a picture on Instagram, when you're playing a video game, right? This also produces a process of convergence, which is going to become one of our big words. We're going to talk about it all the time this semester. Convergence is a technological merging of formerly distinct and incompatible formats into a single format. To just make that super clear, what that means is once upon a time, a phone was a phone and a camera was a camera. And the idea that those were the same thing or that they could exist in the same space would never have been comprehensible to like your grandparents, right? That's a form of convergence. The other definition of convergence is a business practice where media companies merge in order to build greater control for fewer companies, right? So this is when companies buy each other or get all connected to one another in a way that gives them more control over more things. So they not only own the producers of the media, some of them will then also go and buy cable companies, and the cable companies are how you get the media into your house, or right. So you see how this happens. Netflix once upon a time only distributed other people's content. Now they also make content. This is also a form of convergence. There are also expanded representation and fewer hard consensus narratives. One of the things we're going to hear about is that the kind of utopian early days of what people thought the internet was going to be and still has potentials for. Many people find communities that they would not have found otherwise. So you are not relying for your sense of self and your identity on this really simplified, mass-produced story that everyone is being told with very few people being represented. So what does it mean then when you start to have all of this? Because people are consuming what they individually want to consume. This is what we're calling fragmentation. Targeted media produces a niche nation, which means people consume what is familiar to them and what is desirable to them, and they don't necessarily hear stories. So even though we have expanded representation, lots of people resist it, and they just stay in the spaces that feel comfortable to them because that's an option. You can determine what you're looking at in a way that you definitely could not have done if we had expanded representation, but we still had shared media experiences. That would be a very different thing than what it means to have expanded representation in the context of targeted media. So that's something I just want you guys to think a little bit about. You've probably heard a lot of people talk about the siloing of news communities, right? So people only listen to the news that they agree with, or they only read the newspaper they agree with. That's always been to some extent true. It's gotten much, much more escalated with the existence of targeted media outside of just what newspaper you read. Okay, so that's our little rundown of how we got to where we are. So now, where are we? What's happening now? So the 21st century conditions of media in our digital era. So again, we're thinking about mass media and media culture industries, and those are the channels of communication that produce and distribute media products. So this is what we're talking about in this new climate. And we already talked a little bit about convergence. We have both the technological merging of distinct forms of media into a single format, and we also have increasing control of fewer and fewer companies over more and more of the media industry business. And we want to think a little bit about what that means and how that impacts us. So we already talked a little bit about niche nation. So this is a society where people navigate a more varied and complex media landscape. So what that means is if you talk to your parents or grandparents everyone will have watched the same show, right? Friends is such a phenomenon because it was something that literally everyone watched. And so that meant that like you had this shared culture, whereas like you've probably had experiences now where you'll say to somebody, "Oh, have you been watching this?" And you're like, "No, I haven't really gotten into that. I've been watching this other thing." Right. So that's a different kind of experience for people. That happens a lot in different ways. So rather than having that widely shared touchstone experience of admittedly problematic, sometimes consensus narratives, the media technologies that we use and the media products we consume sort us into narrow niches or subcultures through algorithms, right? Connecting us to some people and disconnecting us from others so that we're not seeing all of the things that are happening all at once and we have a sense of the world based largely on what's in front of us. So this has been influenced by multiple factors, and we're going to talk about some of these terms too, like participatory culture, new viewing practices, and fragmentation. Participatory culture is a key. I also teach a class on this if anyone's interested. I teach social media, and participatory culture. This term was originated by a man named Henry Jenkins, describing a culture in which it's relatively easy for people to create and share their own content and build connections with each other, right? So what that means is that you don't just go to the movies. You can make a TikTok about the movie that you just saw, or you can make a video about something that you're interested in, whatever that might be, whatever you might be interested in. You can produce these media objects that then can be shared with many people. So what's interesting about participatory culture is this is different than interpersonal participation, right? So it's not like you sitting next to your neighbor and saying, "Hey, I sewed this quilt," right? This is a different thing where you are producing content that can be seen by lots of people, and that then can bring you other communities. This is what defines participatory culture. Our next key concepts that come out of this understanding of niche nation is fragmentation and new viewing practices that we have. So these new viewing practices have helped to produce the experience of niche nation. Again, we have fewer and less powerful consensus narratives because we, as our viewing practices indicated by this image below, shows the difference between a mass fan base and a multiplicity of niches. So we have lots of different people watching lots of different things. And so fragmentation, what is the effect of this, right? It's the separation of what had been the mass into different groups that are sorted largely by the algorithm, which we'll talk more about. So this can lead to problems like political polarization, because again, your worldview is so affected by what it is that you're consuming as far as media and the way that you're understanding the world, right? If communication is how culture reaches us and culture is an expression of shared values. If we're seeing different media being communicated to us, if we're not sharing media, then we're experiencing different value structures. And that means that we have some pretty big issues that we have to tackle socially, of people not knowing how to communicate with one another because the foundations of their value structures have been shifted, and to some extent through this process of fragmentation. I'm so curious how you guys are experiencing this and what you think about it. So now that we've talked a little bit more about the contemporary media environment, we're going to talk about how we might be thinking about media and thinking about how we study and engage with media. So your book gives you this helpful diagram for the 3 ways that we engage with media. And it looks very neat and tidy. It's an equilateral triangle of roughly the same size pieces. I think that for most of us, this would probably not be the case, right? We probably have very shifting to these roles, and they change over time. But you have your consumption. We're going to talk more about how media consumption works in a minute, whether or not that's passively consuming something or how we consume in a way that might actually be more active, even if you're not making something or putting something back out, right? And then we have producers, media producers, which all of us do on some level or another, unless you somehow have managed not to participate in social media at all. It's very unlikely that you aren't having some role of media production. And then finally, there's this question of the media citizen, right? So a citizen is a figure who has rights and responsibilities. In democratic societies, citizenship comes with expectations of being informed, participating in civic life, and caring about the common good. So media have been studied a couple of different ways over time. Media studies have different historical moments. And originally, people had what's referred to as a linear model for understanding, and that was eventually replaced by the cultural model or the cultural studies model. The linear model of communication, it's important to note this existed before mass personal communication. It existed before social media. So linear model of communications asks a pretty basic set of questions. Who says what, through what channel, to whom, and with what effect? So in other words, who is the person who is producing the content? What is the content saying? What channel are they using to say it? So in other words, what medium or media, if we go back to our original definitions are they using and who are they speaking to? Who is this directed at? And then they would study what are the effects of that. So if you think about this in terms of people had a lot of panics, we'll talk about this later in the semester too, of how people responded to mass media. You have a kind of passive idea about the consumer. This is the basis of a lot of fears of how people respond to media, because there's an assumption that it's a passive process, that they refer to it sometimes as a hypodermic effect, that we are having ideas injected into us. And the linear model of communication is interested in who does that, why they do it, and what those effects are, right? So because a lot of scholars were really disappointed with the way that the linear model of communication worked, and this idea that people who were consuming media were doing so passively, that didn't seem correct to them, they came up with the cultural method, or the cultural studies model of communication. And so what this means is that we're having a kind of interaction as audiences, that even though the producers of our media texts, right, and the media texts are anything that we're looking at, so the media industries might have specific intentions when they're producing media texts, but media users might engage it in a way that is different than the intentions of those texts or the people who are trying to put it together. They might make something different out of it. And then a lot of that is largely inflected by people's experiences of cultural context. Cultural context being all of the interconnected economic, political, historically specific conditions and practices that characterize our social world, but also characterize the specific cultural contexts of individuals. That can be different scales, right? That can be national, it can be smaller groups. Media industries, you have all these terms here that you can look up. The PDF for this is available. This is also in your book. So we're going to talk more about cultural studies in a future week when we look at how we study media and we think about a process called encoding and decoding, which we'll do an exercise with. Your book wants you to understand their motivations for us talking about history. I don't think that we really necessarily need to break this down in such a formalized way. The idea is that looking at history helps us understand how today's environment came to exist, and that it's the result of choices. It is not a natural reality that just sprung up as is, that people made specific choices, businesses grew in particular ways, regulation existed or didn't in ways that produced the current circumstances, and that those are decisions based on individuals and their relationship to power structures. And then lastly, it's also really critical for us to think about history because it can help us understand the present better, right? If you live entirely in the present with no reflection on how it was that we got here and you don't see those kinds of backgrounds, it can feel really difficult to see past. And if you can't see past something, if you can't understand how it came into being, it gets really hard to think about how you might change it, right? How we can imagine the possibility of having different structures and different systems, that gets expanded when we look at how it was that it all came into existence in the first place. And it gives you breathing room to think about how you might not necessarily agree with the current moment in some way or another, right? Whether that's the fact that we are becoming more and more reliant on technology, and yet technology is not necessarily more available to everyone, right? If we're thinking about those kinds of things, looking at how we ended up here, looking at how other countries made different decisions or other groups of people made different decisions and have different results in their contemporary moment can help us have new eyes to think about how we want to move forward and what's next. So that's why we're going to spend quite a bit of time thinking about what happened with the emergence of all of these different medias. And again, that's like a good 4 weeks in our semester where we'll be talking about history. Now we're going to move on to media and the politics of culture. So we're going to talk a little bit here about representation and concepts of narrative, but I'm not going to get super deeply into this because your textbook does a really good job of doing this, talking you through specific media objects. So I would really like if you go check out those texts, look at the book, think about how they're talking about this, think about how they're asking you to look at Black Panther, right? So the kinds of questions they're asking you about who made this, when they made it, why they made it, how it has different kinds of impact. Those are the kinds of questions I'm going to want you to be using all the time in the back of your mind when you're looking at media throughout this semester. So spend some good time with that section of your textbook. Our book does a really great job. This edition corrects a missing segment of this chapter by asking us to think about media and representation. And so we're going to get into this much more when we get into the week that we're doing film. And we're talking about things like cultural imperialism and what the kinds of effects that sort of homogenous culture can have. But this week, you have some really great stuff in the book looking at Black Panther and other media. And it gives you some good indications of the kinds of questions that you should be asking when you're thinking about this stuff. So who and what is excluded from a culture's media representation? Who gets to exist in media? Who gets to see themselves? And what happens if the experiences of some people remain invisible while experiences of other people are repeatedly made central? You guys are growing up in a time period where there's much more media representation of different people, different body types, different skin colors, different ethnic groups, different cultural communities, different languages, but it is still not equal. And when we get to the question of narrative, we're going to talk about how it is that just because you have more people of different groups being represented doesn't mean they're being represented well. So if you look across media, a variety of texts, what patterns do you see about the kinds of roles and the kinds of stories that different people are being asked to play out when they are represented, right? So what stereotypes are being created? And then the biggest question for this is, who controls those representations? And we're going to talk about this in every form of media we talk about this semester. Who is it that's actually in the rooms making the decisions about what we see and who plays those parts, who's paid for them? Are we seeing a kind of equal representation in the decision-making bodies that's also reflected in roles or not? And how does that then affect what it is we are seeing? So these are some important questions I want you to also always be thinking about when we're engaging with media over the semester. Go back to your book, spend time with that section on Black Panther, and also the really good one that they have on page 20, looking at representations of people during COVID. And it's a section called Examining Ethics, Telling Stories About Voices We Seldom Hear. Spend some time with that. That's a really good one because, again, the question is not only are we seeing all the people, it's who are they when we see them? Are we hearing the complexities of those stories, right? So we're going to talk about this concept of narrative. A narrative is a storytelling process. Media stories put events in context and shape how we understand our daily lives in the larger world. We have some persistent narrative frames that are different from one culture to the next sometimes, right? So these that are listed here are very popular in America. The idea of good versus evil, David versus Goliath, stories about coming of age, success against great odds, so the underdog, and heroes' journeys to victory, right? These are story structures that appear everywhere. And I have a bunch of images up here. I want you to understand that when we're talking about how narrative story structures appear, we're not only talking about how they appear in things like films and novels, but how they get used in the media stories that we're told. So the news relies on these, businesses rely on these kinds of structures and how they're advertising to you. Public relations make use of these kinds of stories when they're trying to convince you to be on the side of a company after it's done something bad. So down on the bottom here, you see the story about Katrina, the fact that people were constructed in two completely different ways for doing the exact same thing, right? In one case, you had people who were turned into looters, who were accused of being criminal for doing the exact same thing that other people were framed as doing what was needed to survive, as being even potentially heroes because somebody suggested that maybe they were going to be sharing those goods when there was no real facts of evidence on either side of that, right? But those stories come into play in how the media, how news frames our understandings of things. And also how we then, because we're also producers, right? We all do this too. When you get on social media, when you tell a story about something, a lot of what you're seeing in fights about media narratives are people having different ideas about who's playing what roles in these recurring narratives that we all use all the time. We're going to have a whole week where we talk about PR and the framing of messages, and this is going to be really important for us. One of the last things our chapter delves into is ways of understanding culture. So within those narrative frameworks, we're also looking at values that are being applied to them, right? It has often a lot to do with moral judgments. Those moral judgments are often aligned in relationship to definitions of high or low culture and superior qualities of high culture, in other words, perceived to be more moral. These are also usually things that are available to wealthier people who are more educated versus inferior qualities of culture, which are framed to be things that are somehow lower class, lower income, right? Tainted by commercial forces, not somehow like magically free of capitalism that we all live under, right? So these are important terms that are going to come up for us. And this gets framed in the skyscraper model of cultural value. This is included in your textbook too. You can see here that it puts things at the top that are considered to be very valuable. Those are kind of Shakespeare, for instance, which is listed here as the very top of culture. And then you have reality TV at the very bottom. The thing is that those have more in common than people like to admit, right? I don't know if any of you have already taken classes or they've been reading Old English and they understand what Shakespeare is really talking about. They were originally put on in very much kind of popular culture arena, right? Yes, they covered some important critical themes of humanity and they were beautifully written, but they were also messy soap operas where people were drunk all the time. Booze was sold. There were actually sex workers working in the aisles, and there were little bladders full of blood so that they would splash the audience during the show. It was a chaotic thing, and it was not meant for only a certain subset of the population. They were popular culture. They have risen to being high culture now, but they were created as a form of popular culture. These hierarchical ideas, because somehow it's now rare for people to appreciate Shakespeare or to be able to read it, that then moves it into the hierarchical position of high culture. It's related to education levels, etc., right? Things move around. The skyscraper model is hierarchical. It is also very classist. We all very likely have experiences all up and down this structure of things that we like, that we engage in. And this is an old model that used to be in the other edition of the book. It's not in this one anymore, but this is a kind of counter to the hierarchy model. This is the map model, which puts things rather than vertical, this is horizontal, and it's also much more diverse. It's the idea that we have all these intersecting tastes that might conflict, that seem strange next to each other, but that this is actually how most of us really consume and engage and understand culture, is through this kind of intersecting, messy way of meandering along things that we just like, and looking at where we make those distinctions from is much more enlightening than imagining a kind of hierarchy of good media and bad media. Okay, and our last section of this is the media literacy in action, describing the critical process for all of you that you're going to need this throughout the semester. The first question is why, right? Why a critical approach? Why does this matter? And our book gives us a few reasons and to think about how this is important in how we pay attention to and how we can cultivate media literacy in ourselves as critical consumers of media, and how that helps us participate in broader debates and culture, but it also helps us think about our role as media citizens. So how we can use media to help bring about something positive in society, how we think about our engagement with it. So we need to have a critical eye in order to see that, to make sure that media is having that positive effect that we're looking for. Another reason to be critical is that we live in a constantly changing media environment, and this is how you can maintain an ability to stay current on understanding what's happening, because it's going to require different standards by which we judge society and culture. We have new relationships to what those media representations mean and the kinds of narratives that they're producing and how they're producing them. So media literacy is really important for this. And if you're going to be somebody who continues to engage with media, to work with media in your life, knowing how those standards and values are shifting in relationship to technologies and their affordances is going to be really important for you. It's important for all of us who are just citizens of the world as well. Okay, so what exactly is the critical process? This is a pretty useful process, I find, to go through these steps. So you have description, analysis, interpretation, evaluation, and engagement. And this is, of course, by no means the only way to be critical around media, but it's a really useful framework and it's a good step-by-step process that we're going to build off of in this class to help us break down pieces of media and do this kind of critical thinking so that it can help us see and know how different facets of media work. And it allows us to engage in these bigger discussions in a way that's based in data, right? So this is probably the most important thing I can get you guys to understand. That description one, that number one, it seems like the least important. It is the most important. And this is true for anybody who's ever going to go into social science research or anything like that. The data that you collect, the materials that you're describing. So if you're watching a documentary and you say just when it was made and who did it and who, just really general stuff, and then here's the plot, that doesn't tell you very much, right? But if you take the kind of notes that are like, okay, they used this kind of footage and they asked these kinds of people for their opinions, and this is how they integrated those edits into historical footage that they were using, or archival footage, and this is the sort of music that they were playing when they did that. And that's going to give you so much more information to use in your analysis, interpretation, and evaluations for you to consider patterns that are emerging and ask yourself, what do those patterns mean? And come up with a sense of what might be the impacts of that, right? You can't do 2, 3, and 4 if you haven't really done 1. 1 is the most important part here. take good notes. When you're looking at media, really think about it. You're going to keep basically a media journal when you're doing these assignments. I want you to write down what you're seeing. It's important to ask yourself these questions. If I'm watching a documentary and they use swelling, sad music versus if they use something happy, but the footage is exactly the same, that's going to change my experience of that. And that's going to make me ask different questions about what the intentions were of the people who made it, right? So those are the kinds of things I want you guys to pay close attention to. You're going to spell stuff out really carefully, and that's what's going to help you figure out how to do this process. And this is going to get developed for you through this class. This is an important skill set, and you're going to use it in your other classes moving forward. And possibly in the work that you do, especially for those of you who want to go into media studies or go be media writers or in some way get involved in media. This is important stuff for you to know. Okay, so that is the end of our first chapter lecture. This was a big one. They are not going to be this long most of the time for single chapter lectures. This is longer than usual. You all have some work you've got to do this week. Don't forget to do this week's participation activity on Canvas. Do your introductions, let me know who you are. And then if you have any additional questions or anything that I didn't cover that you're concerned about, please let me know. Take a look at your mass media mini lecture sign-up sheet to see if there's any topics that are interesting to you. Maybe something came up in this week that you know we're going to come back to that you might find interesting, say on the week on books or other forms of media history that you want to delve into. If you have any questions, I will see you Monday night at 5 p.m. when we have standard office hours. All right. Thanks, guys. I'm really looking forward to working with you. And thank you so much for your patience getting through this first video.